You wake up. It's cold, damp. The stone beneath you is doing its best impression of a meat locker floor, and the rough wool of your sleeping shift, basically a potato sack with dreams, is clinging to your skin like it's been dipped in failure. The only light in the room is a sliver of morning sun sneaking through a window the size of a large rat. That rat is probably still sleeping in your shoe. By the way, congratulations. You've made it to the 14th century. Now, take a moment, yes, right now, before you truly settle in. If you're already getting cozy under your blankets, or hiding from the reality that you have to wake up in 4 hours, consider liking this video and subscribing. But only if you actually enjoyed this bizarre, historically accurate descent into fabric-based madness. And drop a comment. Tell me what country you're in, and what ungodly hour you've decided to learn about medieval textile hierarchies. The comment section is basically the medieval village square, except without the risk of being accused of heresy. Okay, back to your miserable existence. You're not a noble. Obviously. Nobles don't sleep on hay stuffed with expired dreams. You're a townsperson, one of the lucky ones. Not quite dirt poor, but you're definitely not dripping in gold-threaded brocade either. Your clothes are what we now politely call earth tones. Because you're not allowed to wear anything else. And yes, that's a thing. In medieval Europe, color was a social grenade. It told everyone exactly who you were, who you weren't, and how many chickens you probably owned. But it didn't stop there. See, in this period, clothes didn't just keep you warm or make you look like a sad potato. They announced your entire place in the divine cosmic order of suffering and taxes. Let's say you stagger out of your home, which is less a home and more a wooden box that occasionally leaks sadness, and step into the muddy lane. Immediately, you're met with a parade of people in various shades of sadness. The butcher wears dull brown, the baker's got a smock that once tried to be white but gave up, and the candlemaker smells like wax, soot, and existential despair. Everyone's wearing dull reds, faded greens, and that mysterious beige gray that seems to come pre-stained. Why? Because unless you were loaded, color was expensive. Like, ruin your family lineage expensive. Dyes didn't come from Hobby Lobby. They came from boiling bugs, fermented urine, and plants that refused to grow unless bribed with tears and peasant blood. The brightest, most obnoxious colors, like rich blues, lurid purples, and hellishly vibrant reds, were reserved for the elite. Not because they looked nice, but because wearing them said, I can afford to boil 10,000 snails just to look slightly purple. You're not that person. You are oatmeal incarnate. And this wasn't just fashion. It was law. Yes, welcome to the world of sumptuary laws, where the government told you what colors and fabrics you were allowed to wear based on your social class. Think of it like a medieval dress code. Except instead of getting detention for violating it, you might get fined, publicly shamed, or possibly accused of impersonating a lord. Which was only slightly better than being accused of witchcraft. Sumptuary laws were like a very judgmental Instagram algorithm. If you wore the wrong color, people assumed you were pretending to be someone richer, better, holier than thou, which was a dangerous game in a world where envy was considered a mortal sin and public hangings were a fun weekend activity. And yet, people tried. Oh, did they try? Some would sneak in tiny bits of color into their clothes, like lining a sleeve with a richer hue, or hiding a fancy trim inside a collar. A bit like wearing designer socks under your work uniform and feeling smug about it. Of course, if the local sumptuary patrol caught wind, you could be stripped of your illegal fashion flair and fined enough to make your children cry. Not that your children weren't already crying. Everyone's children were crying. It was the 1300s. Joy was considered suspicious. Anyway, let's talk about blue. Today, blue is everywhere. Jeans, logos, baby showers. But in the early medieval period, blue was rare, reserved, sacred. In the 12th century, the Virgin Mary got a PR makeover. An artist started painting her in deep, heavenly blue made from lapis lazuli, a stone mined in Afghanistan, carted over impossible terrain, and ground into the pigment equivalent of bankruptcy. This suddenly made blue the color of purity and divine love, which meant only the wealthy or the very holy got to wear it. So if you, a common wheel mender from Swamp on Rot, started parading around in ultramarine robes, people would assume you were either a saint or a liar. Spoiler, you were not a saint. Now, let's go red. Red was a power move. It shouted money, blood, authority. and I'm probably allowed to punch you. The best red came from Kermes insects, tiny bugs harvested from oak trees, dried, crushed, and turned into a luxurious crimson. Imagine explaining that your cloak cost the lives of thousands of bugs and the souls of several dyers who had to inhale boiling bug fumes for hours. No dry cleaning either. One mud puddle and poof, your social credibility is gone. But red wasn't just for the rich. Prostitutes were also made to wear red, because, of course, medieval Europe had to make everything uncomfortable. This added a lovely layer of confusion where you could be either a nobleman or a sanctioned sex worker, depending on how long someone stared at your cloak. Green. That's the middle class. A sort of social Switzerland. Not powerful, not poor, just competent and vaguely acceptable. Faded greens were common for artisans, scribes, and people who could read but didn't have land. Bright green, though, still cost you, like getting the VIP version of being forgettable. Yellow was for outcasts. Sometimes Jews, sometimes lepers, sometimes anyone who annoyed the local bishop too much. Yellow was a warning sign. It was the medieval version of do not engage. If you wore yellow, people crossed the road, unless they were throwing things. And then there was black. Today, black is sleek, powerful, the color of every turtleneck-wearing tech CEO and moody teenager. In medieval times, it was complicated. Dyeing something truly black was hard. Like, unnecessarily hard. It often came out patchy or purplish. But if you could afford true black, deep, even, inky black, you were either loaded or in mourning. Or both. Of course, you could try faking it with charcoal or soot, but then you just looked like you lost a fight with a chimney. Anyway, you wander the muddy street, still half asleep and vaguely hungry, and see a flash of purple across the square. Someone important is arriving. Purple was the Gucci of the medieval world. Tyrian purple, to be exact. It came from the Mediterranean, extracted from thousands of murex sea snails. The process smelled like rotting fish dipped in vinegar and existential dread. Only kings, emperors, and very pushy bishops could afford it. Wearing it without permission was like walking into the Pope's house and licking the floor. You look down at your own tunic. It's a brownish gray. Maybe once green. Maybe not. It's made of rough wool that scratches you in places you didn't know you could be scratched. The neckline is frayed. The seams are uneven. But it's yours. You made it last spring when the sheep stopped biting you long enough to shear them. No fast fashion here. You spun the wool yourself, dyed it in a cauldron that still smells like despair, and stitched it together by firelight while contemplating whether saints ever had to darn their own socks. Spoiler, they didn't. They had followers for that. As you walk, the town crier shouts the latest news. Someone's stolen a bolt of forbidden cloth. A scandal. It was crimson, rich, sinful, luxurious. Whoever wears it next might be fined, flogged, or promoted. Depends who sees them first. You pause. You look at the dye stains on your hands. And you wonder, could you get away with it? But then you remember last month's incident. Some poor fool tried to marry up by wearing a blue surcoat with golden embroidery. He lasted a full 2 hours before someone noticed, and he was publicly sheared. Like a sheep. They called it the faux silk incident. No one talks about him anymore. Or rather, they only talk about him. You decide not to risk it. You keep walking. Smells of rotting cabbage and warm horse fill the air. Someone dumps a chamber pot into the street and it narrowly misses your boots, which are made of leather so cracked they should probably come with a warning label. The bells toll. Another day begins. You're still dressed like a serf, still dreaming of blue. And so the world of medieval color continues, rigid, weird, and slightly itchy. Like history, really. Now take a breath. Stretch if you like. You've made it through the morning without being fined for fashion crimes. But there's still the marketplace, the church, the feast, and the festival. All with their own rainbow of social nightmares. We'll get there. Eventually. But first, let's see how badly your neighbors are messing up their wardrobe choices. You're still in the street. Still wrapped in a robe that could double as a burlap tragedy. The town has started to stir now, with clomping hooves, the occasional chicken escape attempt, and the unmistakable sound of someone yelling about cheese theft. It's fine. That's just Tuesday. You trudge toward the market square, past a row of lopsided homes where laundry hangs like a desperate prayer on a rope. And that's when you see her. The butcher's wife. Agnes. Again, Agnes is everything you're not. She's got real shoes, made of stitched leather and not held together with twine and regrets. Her overdress is dyed a deep rusty red, the kind of red you only get from madder root if you soak it for days and don't mind smelling like sour soup for a week. Her sleeves are tight, scandalously tight. She's even got buttons, which are pointless unless you're rich or deeply insecure. And of course, her coif is white. Not once white and now dishwater beige, but white, unstained by the sins of the medieval world. And she knows it. She walks like someone who just finished judging you in her head and found you deeply lacking. But here's the kicker. Agnes isn't even a noble. She just married into meat. That's right. Her wealth comes from the daily dismemberment of animals. Her fortune is soaked in entrails and pig fat, and yet she struts like Lady Gaga of swine. That overdress? Technically legal. Just barely. But if she adds one more layer of imported trim, the town reeve might have to have a word. And by word, we mean public interrogation followed by a small parade of shame. You pass her, nod politely, and pretend not to inhale the scent of boiled beef clinging to her like status. You reach the market square, and it's alive now. Loud. Smelly. Very smelly. The blend of open fish stalls, human sweat, livestock emissions, and the ghost of 100 cooked onions assaults your senses like a fermented slap to the nose. And here's where the colors really come out to play. The spice merchant is wearing saffron-dyed sleeves, yellow and bright, and definitely illegal unless you're in the Spice Guild, which he is. Or says he is. His apron is stained with turmeric, and you're pretty sure his beard is more spice than hair at this point. The fishmonger is in dull gray, appropriately sad, with crusted salt across his jerkin. His fingers are webbed with dried scales and regret. He doesn't care about color. He only cares about surviving long enough to not be eaten by his own inventory. The textile merchant? Now there's a show-off. His stand is a kaleidoscope of forbidden temptations. Bolts of crimson, indigo, and that dangerously alluring violet lie stacked like sin behind his stall. He's got a bolt of Lincoln green that's so bright it looks illegal, and it probably is. His smile is the kind of smile that says, yes, this was smuggled past 3 border checkpoints, and no, I will not tell you how. You reach out to touch a swatch of blue. Not just any blue, woad blue. Woad is a plant that has been weaponized into fashion. It smells like rotting compost and death, but after weeks of fermenting, it gives you a beautiful, rich blue that will stain your hands and soul forever. It was the poor man's lapis lazuli, and yes, your ancestors painted themselves in it before running into battle naked. You try not to think about that. You glance around to see if anyone's watching, then rub the blue fabric between your fingers. It's soft. Suspiciously soft. Probably imported from Italy. Italian cloth was like the cocaine of the medieval world, expensive, addictive, and frowned upon unless you were a duke. You ask the merchant the price. He tells you. You laugh out loud because it costs more than your house. You thank him and walk away, dignity slightly torn. You duck into the alley behind the bakery to sulk, where the baker's apprentice is dumping ash and whispering obscenities to a burned loaf. You sit beside a pile of used straw, the kind that's not even good enough for pigs anymore, and consider your options. Option 1. Continue to dress like a sad earth spirit. Option 2. Risk financial ruin by buying a single ribbon dyed in forbidden blue, and then die in style. Tough choice. Let's talk about ribbons for a second. Ribbons were the medieval version of social climbing. You couldn't afford a tunic in crimson silk? Fine. But maybe, just maybe, you could swing a thin strip of it and tie it around your sleeve. Something to hint that you had aspirations, even if your boots were mostly holes and fungus. Ribbons were flirtation, rebellion, and ambition all tied into one strip of fabric. Naturally, sumptuary laws hated them. Laws got very specific. Only persons of noble blood may wear ribbons dyed in cochineal. No woman under the rank of countess shall line her sleeves in fur of squirrel. Yes, squirrel. Don't laugh. In 1363, English laws stated that unless you were a knight or richer, you were banned from wearing imported cloth, gold embroidery, or anything lined in squirrel fur. So if you were sitting there thinking squirrel pelts were trash, nope. They were fashion goals. You climbed to your feet. The day is warming up, which in medieval England means it's now slightly less terrible. The mud is stickier, the smells more pronounced. Someone is singing a lute ballad about moldy cheese and heartbreak. A noble procession clatters by. And that's when you see it. The nobleman, probably a minor lord, riding on a white horse that clearly resents him. His cloak is bright purple, embroidered with gold thread and covered in tiny lions. It's so heavy that it takes 2 pages just to carry the train behind him. His boots are polished. His beard is oiled. He looks like he smells like sandalwood and superiority. You stare. You shouldn't stare. But you do. Because that purple? That's not just any purple. That's Tyrian purple. The ancient, royal, murdered snail kind. To make just a few grams of this dye, someone had to crush thousands of sea snails, boil them in lead pots, and survive the fumes without their skin falling off. Wearing Tyrian purple was like announcing, "I've burned an entire ecosystem to look mildly impressive." Of course, by this point in history, most Tyrian purple was long gone. Too expensive. Too difficult to make. So people faked it. They'd mix red and blue. Or overdye cloth. Sometimes they'd even use lichens. Yes, lichens. Mossy, crusty little growths scraped off rocks. Medieval fashion was glamorous like that. You watched the noble pass by, feeling both envy and satisfaction. His cloak might be expensive, but yours doesn't require 2 assistants to operate. You wander into the church, partly for shelter and partly because you haven't seen a holy relic in a while and it's starting to feel suspicious. Inside, it's cool, dim, and full of incense smoke. The priest is wearing vestments that are, let's say, elaborate, gold-threaded, embroidered, stiff. The kind of garment that screams, "I have renounced earthly pleasures, except these 5 layers of brocade from Venice." Even in the church, color was hierarchy. The holier the holiday, the more vibrant the robes. Red for martyrs, green for normal Sundays, purple for penance, and white for when someone important dies or rises again, which happened more often than you'd expect in a good Catholic calendar. You slide into a pew behind a woman whose wimple is perfectly starched, and who smells faintly of lavender and self-importance. You're reminded, yet again, that even in the house of God, color is watching you, judging you, separating the righteous from the itchy. Mass ends. You walk back outside, blinking in a light, ears full of Latin you only half understood. A child runs past you in a tunic dyed bright orange, probably an accident. His parents will regret that when someone reports them. You head home. Your home smells like peat smoke, boiled cabbage, and the faint, lingering disappointment of the ancestors. Your mattress is stuffed with straw and possibly rodents. But it's yours. And you take off your dull tunic and hang it up carefully. You'll wear it again tomorrow. And the day after. Because in medieval Europe, your clothing wasn't about comfort or self-expression. It was about survival. Social camouflage. A tightrope walk over the pits of class warfare, ecclesiastical judgment, and the occasional yeast infection from unwashed linen. So you lay down. In your gray, itchy blanket. In your room that leaks wind. In a world painted in colors you're not allowed to wear. And you drift off. Tomorrow, maybe you'll dare a green ribbon. Or maybe not. You wake up to the sound of someone shouting about ale. Again, the shouting isn't new. What's new is that today, the ale isn't yours. It's your neighbor's, and it's gone sour. Or maybe it's full of bugs. Possibly both. Welcome to the medieval beverage industry, where food safety regulations are still about 800 years away and everyone's favorite drink tastes faintly like wood, desperation, and regret. You stretch under your scratchy blanket, still wrapped in yesterday's dreams, something about rabbits and a suspiciously stylish chic. You rub your eyes, stand up, and knock your head on the ceiling beam. Again. Because the ceiling is 5 feet tall, and you, unfortunately, are not. As you reach for your tunic, yes, that tunic, the same one from yesterday and the day before, you stop. Something's wrong. It's Tuesday. And Tuesdays, in the sleepy corner of 14th century Europe, mean 2 things, stew and laundry. And laundry means color. Not new color. Not good color. But the slow erosion of color, the bleeding of status from every thread as your only decent overdress fades from dusty plum to sad porridge. You pull your tunic over your head, wincing at the texture, equal parts wool and regret, and step outside. The air smells like chimney smoke and moist hay, a promising sign. Your neighbor, Alice, no last name, Just Alice, because surnames are still figuring themselves out, is hanging her laundry. You glance at her linens. Beige. Slightly beige. And then a sock that is, bafflingly, blue. You blink. Because that blue is not just any blue. That's woad blue. Fresh woad blue. Now, you're not here to accuse anyone of social fraud. But Alice makes her living plucking feathers from dead geese and complaining about the plague. She should not own anything this vibrant. Nice sock, you say casually, as if your entire sense of social order hasn't just been shattered by a piece of hosiery. She shrugs. Found it. Of course she did. Found it, as in stolen from someone wealthier, or bartered during a blackout ale binge, or gifted by a cousin who maybe stabbed a tax collector once. That's the kind of blue sock it is. And this brings us to the inevitable question, how did color, literal dye, become such a high-stakes game of social roulette? Let's back up. You see, in medieval Europe, dye wasn't just something you bought. It was something you suffered for. Something you earned. The process of dyeing fabric was like a medieval cooking show, except everyone smelled like fermented pea, and someone always lost a finger. Take madder root. A classic. You dig it up from the earth, dry it, crush it, soak it for days, then boil your fabric with it until it turned red. Not a sexy crimson, more like blood mixed with rust. Still, it was respectable. Middle-class red. But you know what dye was free? None of them. Okay, that's not true. Some were free, in the sense that you could make them yourself if you were willing to spend weeks crushing leaves, soaking bark, or urinating into a barrel. Yes, that was a method. In fact, one of the most common methods of setting dye, called mordanting, involved soaking your fabric in stale urine to make the color stick. So yes, medieval fashion was brought to you by P. The dyer's quarter in any town was a violent olfactory experience. These people were not just artisans, they were chemical warriors. Their houses stank. Their hands were permanently dyed. They smelled like vinegar and ammonia and defeat. But their fabrics? Vibrant, dangerous, often illegal. You walk further down the road, past a group of children arguing about who gets to eat the blackened crust of a barley loaf. Past a group of monks quietly judging everyone. You pass the tailor's hut. The tailor is busy. As always, he's hunched over a doublet that's been cut to within an inch of its legal status. The sleeves are too long. The collar is lined with fur. It has buttons, actual buttons, which might seem normal to you, dear listener, but at this point in history were only slightly less scandalous than licking the bishop. Buttons meant you could unfasten your clothes without help, which meant you might remove them by choice, which meant sin. So naturally, buttons were regulated. But the real action is in the back of the shop. That's where he keeps the dye samples. You peer in and see it, a rack of dyed fabrics hanging like forbidden fruit. Crimson, indigo, saffron yellow, Tyrian purple, cochineal red, and that mysterious green-black that looks like forest shadows and ambition. These are more than colors. They are statements. They scream, I am somebody. Or at least, I bribed the reeve and I know how to hide receipts. You look closer. One swatch is labeled Bishop Blue. It's a soft, dusty hue, made from mixing woad and sadness, only worn by clergy of a certain level or rich widows pretending to be holy. Another is Gambeson Gray. Utilitarian, cheap, faintly itchy. The choice of mercenaries, peasant farmers, and emotionally unavailable husbands. There's even one marked Merchant's Mistress Mauve. This one is vibrant, flirty, possibly made from imported dye and regret. And then there's Dead Rabbit Brown. You don't ask. You leave the shop, heart full of longing, and stomach full of nothing. Because fashion might be eternal, but so is hunger. You pass a beggar wearing a patch cloak that was probably blue once, before time, grime, and the crushing weight of poverty turned it the color of wet stone. And here's the thing, color faded. No synthetic stabilizers. No color-fast processes. Just nature, dirt, and the sun conspiring to turn your luxurious violet tunic into something that resembled moldy eggplant. You sit on a stone bench and watch the people walk by. The knight's daughter, wearing a pale green overdress. Legal, but only because her family's been buying favor with the abbey for 3 generations. The miller's wife, wearing brown wool with red stitching. A statement. A subtle rebellion. One thread at a time. A visiting merchant from Flanders, practically glowing in saffron silk and a hat so large it has its own gravitational pull. And then there's you, wrapped in your neutral colors, your socially safe hues, your linen smock that has been washed so many times it's now translucent in places you'd rather it wasn't. And you realize this isn't just fashion. This is language. Color is how you speak without talking. It's how you say, I'm powerful, or I know people, or I'm pretending not to be poor. It's also how you get arrested. Because every town, every kingdom, every decade had its own set of sumptuary laws, rules that dictated exactly what you could and could not wear based on your class, your profession, your moral purity, and how much your king hated fun. Some were reasonable. Don't wear gold unless you're royalty. Okay, fine. Others were less so. No cloth of silver on Wednesdays. Only prostitutes may wear striped veils. Shoes may not be more than 4 inches long at the toe. That last one failed. People just started wearing 6-inch shoes and pretending they were 4. And if you broke the rules, fines, confiscation, public shame, occasionally a lashing, always gossip, and in some cases, death. Because clothing wasn't just a matter of taste. It was a matter of order. A threat to the divine hierarchy. A visual rebellion. You sigh, stretch, crack your neck. You've learned a lot today. Mostly that your clothes say more about you than your words ever could. And that those clothes probably say, I smell faintly of turnips and I can't afford buttons. You head home again. Past the tannery. Past the fishmonger's stall. Past Agnes, who definitely noticed your staring earlier. The sun is setting. The town glows in amber light. And all around you, color is fading, fabrics losing their luster, shadows stretching, ambitions dimming. You reach your door. Step inside. Kick off your shoes. They fall apart in protest. And you lie down, thinking of woad, of snail shells, of forbidden silks, of all the colors you'll never wear. Tomorrow, maybe you'll try on brown. Maybe not. You wake up cold. Not the dramatic kind of cold. Like you fell through ice, and now your limbs are crystallizing. No, this is the subtle, slow kind, the draft through a hole in the water wall kind. The kind of cold that seeps into your bones like a long, sarcastic apology from the Middle Ages itself. Congratulations. You survived another night in the 14th century. And as a reward, your toes are frozen, your mattress smells like betrayal, and your blanket has become sentient and is considering unionizing. You sit up, rub your eyes with a hand that's suspiciously damp, and glance down at your clothes for the day. You know, the same clothes from yesterday, and the day before, and the one time last month when you briefly considered wearing your festive tunic before remembering it was chewed by a goat during Lent. So you stand, stretch like an aging serf, and reach for your outer layer, a tunic. Wool, obviously. Everything is wool. The color? Let's call it formally green. It may have started life as vibrant moss or perhaps a bold forest hue, but now it resembles something scraped off the bottom of a cartwheel. And this miserable morning is a perfect time to discuss how clothing color worked indoors. I know, thrilling, but trust me, it gets worse. So before you pull that itchy neckline over your freezing head, pause for a moment. Like the video. Subscribe. Only if you like what I'm doing here. I'm not the clothing police. I can't arrest you for scrolling past, but I can haunt you with facts about medieval underpants. And don't forget to comment where you're tuning in from. It's always weirdly fascinating to find someone watching from a Norwegian fjord at 2:30 a.m. in a burrito blanket. Now, back to your regularly scheduled suffering. Let's imagine you're lucky enough to be part of a household with something approaching middle-class aspirations. You have a fire. Sometimes. A door that shuts. Most days. And at least one window that lets in both light and your neighbor's singing goat. You slip on your outer tunic and step into the main room. And immediately regret it. Why? Because color indoors is a trap. Outdoors, color meant power. Bright colors showed off your wealth, your status, your ability to not fall face first into a trough every time it rained. But indoors, that same color betrayed you. Because candles and open flames generally made everything look weird. What looked regal crimson in daylight turned into suspicious brown by firelight. Indigo became mud. Yellow looked like someone had been overly generous with their bladder during the dyeing process. And don't even get me started on what raw will look like in torchlight. Picture the ghost of a sheep that regrets its life decisions. So as you shuffle past the hearth, trying not to catch your tunic on the iron spit again, you begin to understand why most medieval folks didn't bother with loungewear. Your sleeping garments and your working clothes? Same thing. There was no cute oversized hoodie from that festival in 1328. There was just tunic with fewer holes and tunic that has been peed on by the pig. But even in this humble dwelling, color played a role. See that textile hanging on the wall? You might think it's for decoration, or insulation, or to hide the hole your cousin made while fleeing a minor tax dispute. Nope. That's your family's best display of portable wealth, a dyed wool tapestry, maybe woven by your grandmother, maybe stolen from a Flemish trader during a blackout. The color tells the world, or at least your nosy in-laws, that you have culture, taste, possibly a dowry you didn't spend entirely on goats. Now, what's on your feet? If you're lucky, hose. If you're unlucky, nothing. If you're realistic, hose with holes in places that no one wants holes. And these two could be dyed, if, for example, you wanted to flex by having mismatched hose in two different colors. Yes, that was a thing. It was called party coloring, and it was exactly what it sounds like, one leg red, one leg green. Half the tunic blue, the other yellow. Why? Because fashion. And also, to deeply confuse the peasantry. Party coloring was a way to say, I have money, I have fabric, and I will absolutely spend a full hour getting dressed like a Renaissance jester with self-esteem. Did sumptuary laws hate it? Oh, absolutely. Which brings us to our next soul-splitting detail. Indoor lighting made everything worse. You see, candles back then weren't the cute soy-blend eucalyptus-scented jars we have now. They were made of tallow, animal fat, which meant your house constantly smelled like someone was slow-cooking despair. And color under that kind of light? Inconsistent, unreliable, betrayal in every flicker. That bright red tunic you wore to impress your in-laws? By candlelight, it now looks like dried blood. Romantic. Your soft pastel blue overdress? It reads as bruised gray in the hearthlight. And not in a gentle watercolor kind of way. More like I lost a fistfight with my conscience. This meant that even the perception of status indoors could change depending on how bright your fire was. If you were wealthy, you had beeswax candles. Expensive, sweet-smelling, stable light. You could flaunt your silks in all their overpriced glory. If you were everyone else, you had tallow candles or rushlights, which were literally reeds soaked in fat, and about as reliable as your cousin's memory during tax season. So your color? Never guaranteed. It shifted, melted, wavered. Like your understanding of social status after 2 goblets of weak ale. Let's take a break from your miserable breakfast of hard bread and look around the room. See the lady of the house? She's wearing layers. A chemise underneath, an overdress, maybe a cloak if it's cold. Her best garment? A blyot, maybe, if she's lucky. And guess what? It's been dyed. But the dye is patchy. Because it was dyed after being sewn. A cost-cutting method. So now it fades unevenly. And she has to arrange herself just so in the light so it doesn't look like a political statement. Your brother-in-law? Wearing a doublet that looks green from one angle, gray from another, and possibly cursed if the fire flickers too much. Your niece? Covered in smock and mud. Mostly mud. Even the tablecloth, dyed a pale ochre, starts to look vaguely threatening after sundown. And if you were really wealthy, you'd have rooms designed to complement your clothing. We're talking walls painted with rich pigments, lapis lazuli for blue, vermilion for red, gold leaf for, well, gold. Tapestries woven not just to warm the room, but to bounce light back onto your crimson robes so you could appear perpetually majestic, even while reaching for a very medieval version of cheese. These spaces were like the Instagram filters of the 14th century, carefully curated environments designed to make you look richer, smarter, and less covered in lice. But you live in a hut, a cozy, drafty, wood smoke and sauerbraid hut. And inside the hut, your clothes, no matter how lovingly dyed in the stream with your aunt's secret recipe, look like nothing more than damp wool and broken promises. You eat your breakfast, slowly, thinking about how much effort people have always put into looking better than they actually are. How color, even indoors, became a kind of performance. A gamble. A lie that only worked until the candle flickered the wrong way. You finish your crust. Wipe your mouth on your sleeve. The fire pops. The room dims. And all around you, color vanishes. Muted by flame, dulled by soot, robbed of its glory by the simple fact that medieval interiors were not built for vibrancy. You lie back on your straw mattress. Pick a flea off your ankle. And close your eyes, dreaming of a world where blue socks don't make you suspicious, where colors stay true, and where you can wear silk indoors without someone accusing you of witchcraft. You wake up on a cart. This is not your cart. You have no idea whose cart this is. But the unmistakable splinters in your lower back and the rhythmic squeak of a poorly greased axle confirm it. Yes, you are indeed waking up in transit. Again. You're wrapped in a rough woolen cloak dyed a brownish hue that might once have resembled walnut, or maybe diarrhea. It's hard to tell under the early morning fog. You're traveling toward a market fair, or a trial, or a beheading. Who can say? All three use roughly the same route and crowd size. Your head is pounding, possibly from the mead, possibly from the fact that you slept with your head on a goat. Said goat, by the way, is still here, still judging you, still chewing something that may or may not be part of your left sleeve. And as the cart bounces along the muddy road, you're beginning to notice something peculiar. Everyone you pass looks like they came out of a slightly depressing, wool-themed coloring book. Muted yellows, patchy reds, and the occasional blue that looks like it's been washed in bad decisions. So today we're taking a long, scenic roll through the countryside to examine how color was used in public medieval spaces. We've already looked at how colors deceived you indoors. Now it's time to ruin your day outdoors, too. Because if you think medieval fashion was subtle, wait until you meet the walking Crayola box that is the 14th century fairground. Before we begin, you know what I'm about to say. If you've been enjoying this journey into historically accurate disappointment, now's the time to like the video, subscribe if you haven't already, and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. Bonus points if it's 3 a.m. and you're wrapped in your own suspiciously medieval-smelling blanket. Now, back to your mobile misery. The road leads into a village preparing for a local festival. And you, clinging to your goat-smelling wool, are about to be greeted by a scene so colorful it would give a migraine to a monk. People are everywhere, shouting, arguing, bargaining with chickens. And yet somehow, even in this chaos, there is an order to how people are dressed. Let's begin with the obvious, the town crier. He's dressed in a violently bright red and yellow tunic. Party-colored, of course, because the Middle Ages had a deep and mysterious love of garments that looked like a pack of Skittles had an identity crisis. Red and yellow together symbolized urgency, vibrancy, and please listen to me shout about taxes. The red, most likely achieved with madder root, common, earthy, and stable. The yellow, weld or maybe dyer's broom, depending on how committed this town crier is to his aesthetic. Either way, under the glaring morning sun, he looks like a sentient citrus fruit who's just discovered municipal bylaws. You dismount the cart. And by dismount, I mean fall sideways into a puddle. A puddle the exact color of regret. Your cloak, still clinging to your shoulders, is blending in perfectly with the mud, which is not ideal. Because in this moment, your social status is being visually assessed by everyone around you. You are now part of a world where color is currency. And you, dear listener, are bankrupt. You brush yourself off and join the throng heading toward the marketplace. And here's where it gets weird. See that woman selling ribbons? She's wearing a surprisingly vivid green kirtle, cinched tight with a red belt. It's not pure emerald, don't get excited, but it's vibrant enough to catch the eye. Probably dyed with woad mixed with weld. A classic combo. Not quite noble, but definitely a step above man who smells like turnips. Over near the ale stall, a man in a short blue coat hardy is leaning too hard on a barrel. He looks smug. Possibly because blue was the hot Instagram filter of the 14th century. Achieved via woad, yes, that endlessly smelly plant that stains your fingers for days and makes you rethink your career choices. The color blue was a symbol of serenity, nobility, and sometimes please don't arrest me, I'm just upper middle poor. The ale he's drinking? Flat. The color of wet cardboard. But his coat? That blue is doing things. And there's that guy again. The one in the impossibly yellow shoes. That's right, yellow shoes. Now, footwear was not typically the place you'd find fancy colors. But this man? This man is flamboyant. His shoes are pointed. He's clearly compensating for something. Maybe a lack of land. Maybe a really aggressive tax collector. Either way, those shoes were likely colored with saffron. Not because saffron was a good idea, but because it was expensive, which made it automatically fashionable. Let's not forget the children. You look over and see several toddlers chasing each other around Maple. They're dressed in faded homespun, pale blues, browns, off-whites. Nothing screams statusless peasant in training like a linen tunic with 3 generations of stains and exactly 1 button. Their cheeks are smudged with dirt, their noses are running, and their joy is uncontainable. And tragically, their colors are practical. Children were often dressed in colors that wouldn't show wear. Browns, ochres, off-grays. Not because parents didn't love them, but because children in medieval villages were essentially roving chaos goblins, and dressing one in white was tantamount to self-sabotage. You pass a group of monks moving silently through the crowd. Their robes? Uniformly dull. The classic Benedictine black or the Franciscan brown, colors that said, "I've renounced the world and also soap." Religious orders used color deliberately to communicate humility, obedience, and, in some extreme cases, "I am deeply uncomfortable and itchy for Jesus." But then, just as you reach the central square, you see her. A noblewoman. On a horse. Side saddle, obviously, because decorum. Her dress? Deep, bold crimson. The kind of red that says, "I own several people and a tower." Trimmed with gold. Real gold thread, thank you very much. Her headdress is a structured miracle of wire and veil. She smells like roses and contempt. This is power dressing. This is medieval couture. The red? Probably cochineal, if she's rich enough. Imported, difficult, outrageously expensive. More likely matter, but she's layered it with so much gold no one's asking questions. Her appearance in this square is not an accident. It is a statement. Color was never just color in the Middle Ages. It was identity. It was propaganda. It was everything. Now let's shift gears and talk about the role of color in events. Festivals, markets, coronations, color had rules. For example, if you were mourning, you wore black. Not the elegant, goth-chic kind. More like coal-stained wool sack with zero tailoring. Black was expensive, which made grief competitive. The richer you were, the darker your mourning outfit could be. Because if there's one thing medieval society loved more than hierarchy, it was sad hierarchy. Weddings? Depending on the region, brides might wear blue, symbol of purity, or even red, symbol of vitality. White was not the default. That came much later, with Queen Victoria and the slow death of personality. Color also played a part in punishment. Criminals might be forced to wear specific colors to mark their crimes. Yellow, for instance, was often used to denote treason or betrayal in certain regions. Because nothing says social death like being forced into a mustard tunic and paraded through town. Even jesters, those poor souls who existed solely to make kings laugh and occasionally get whipped for bad jokes, had a prescribed color scheme. Party-colored outfits of red, blue, green, and yellow. Why? Because nothing is funnier to a medieval audience than a man who looks like a diced flag and cries inside. And then there were the guilds. Occupational color coding, basically. A weaver's guild might wear blue hoods. A butcher's guild might have green aprons. You could literally identify a person's job based on their wardrobe, which meant medieval LinkedIn was just looking at someone's sleeve and judging. The entire town was a tapestry of human peacocks, trying to flash enough color to earn status without getting arrested for impersonating nobility. But all of this depended, cruelly, on the sun. Because in the wrong light, your prized purple cloak looked like black mold. Your red hose faded to tomato soup. And your saffron hat? Let's just say it didn't scream dignity in the rain. So, by mid-afternoon, the clouds roll in. The fair begins to shut down. People shuffle home, clutching their chickens, their ribbons, their extremely questionable cheese wheels. The noblewoman rides off, her crimson gown flapping like a victory banner in a war no one else was invited to. And you climb back onto your cart, lay your head on your goat, and watch the countryside fade into 1,000 shades of gray, brown, and what even is that? Color in medieval public life was both everything and nothing. A symbol, a weapon, a trap. But mostly, it was wool. Endless, scratchy wool. You wake up to a scratching sound. Not a gentle, curious rustling. No, this is full-on aggressive rodent politics happening somewhere near your feet. The cart is gone. The goat is gone. You are now lying on what might technically be called a bed, though it has all the comfort and hospitality of a burlap sack stuffed with disappointment. It smells like mildew and cabbage and, strangely, hope. Not your hope. Someone else's. Someone long dead. Your eyes adjust slowly to a dim room lit by a single, flickering tallow candle, which smells like melted regret and animal fat. Because that's exactly what it is. You're in a cottage. Maybe an inn. Possibly a peasant hovel. There's a rat chewing a wooden spoon in the corner, and it's looking at you like you're the intruder. You pull your cloak tighter and glance around. Something's different about the space. It's not just the smell of dying vegetables or the inexplicably moist floorboards. It's the color. The walls are daubed a soft ochre, a mixture of earth and lime wash. The curtains, if one can call a scrap of wool and string a curtain, are a washed-out burgundy, perhaps once red, now closer to sadness. And the woman at the hearth, silently stirring a pot of something, is wearing a kirtle dyed the color of very tired spinach. Welcome to color in medieval domestic life. It's quieter here, less performative, but no less judgmental. Because while festivals and court appearances were full of vivid dyes and ostentatious flair, your home life, your real life, it was defined by subtle hues, economic choices, and just enough color to prove you weren't completely falling apart. So before we settle into our musty little tour of household fashion and domestic dyes, remember to like the video, subscribe if this has somehow become your new bedtime ritual, and drop a comment letting me know what you're wearing right now. Bonus points if it's less itchy than a medieval chemise. Now let's set the table. Literally. It's the 13th century, and you are a reasonably respectable peasant. Congratulations. That means you have a roof, 4 walls, and a bed that is shared between too many people and not enough good decisions. Your clothes? Let's start at the skin. Under everything, you're wearing a linen shirt or shift. Undyed, rough, and guaranteed to chafe in places you've never wanted chafed. Linen is your base layer, the one item you're most likely to wash, and it's usually bleached by sun and water. That soft off-white? That's not a design choice. That's all you can afford. Now over that, you wear your working garments, a wool tunic if you're a man, or a kirtle if you're a woman. The color? Depends entirely on your income, your location, and whether your neighbor down the road is hoarding dye plants again. Most common was brown. Every shade of it. Earthy, muddy, sad. Achieved with walnut husks, oak bark, or just life. If you were lucky, you might have something in soft yellow or green, produced from weld or rue or broom, plants that didn't smell great and didn't last long in the sun, but gave just enough tint to say I haven't completely given up. If you were even luckier, you might own a blue overdress. Blue was the holy grail of the working class. Dyed with woad, it was a statement of modest stability. And it smelled like cabbage and decay for weeks after dying. But hey, so did your husband, so it all evens out. You glance down at your sleeves and notice a faint discoloration from last week's mutton stew. This is fine. This is your life. Laundry day is next week, assuming it doesn't rain. Again. Across the room, the woman at the hearth turns. She hands you a wooden bowl. The contents are beige, vaguely lumpy. It might be porridge. It might be punishment. But what's interesting is the cloth wrapped around her hair, a wimple, yellowing with age, and spotted with soot. Even that small piece of fabric tells a story. Married women covered their hair, often in veils, caps, or hoods. The color? Usually white or pale gray, because dyeing linen was expensive and you didn't want your headwear attracting attention. Especially if that attention came from the local priest. Children in the house wore hand-me-downs. Faded, patched, occasionally held together with bone pins or sheer willpower. Their colors were often indistinguishable from the furniture, which was ideal because they were frequently mistaken for furniture anyway. Medieval parenting was 40% discipline, 60% hoping your children didn't fall into the fire. You finish your bowl of beige and walk outside. The cottage garden is small, but here's where the magic happens. See that tangled patch of weeds near the fence? That's not weeds. That's weld. And bedstraw. And woad, if you're brave or have no nose. Many families grew their own dye plants. Not because it was fun, but because buying dyed fabric from a merchant was laughably outside your budget. You pick a few leaves and imagine the process ahead. Crushing, boiling, fermenting, waiting. It takes days, weeks, and all for a faint tint that might wash out the first time you get caught in a medieval rainstorm, which, to be clear, is not water. It is sky filth. Still, there's pride in it. Homemade dyes gave your clothes individuality. You might not be able to afford crimson like a noble, but you could have a very nice beige green that no one else had. Unless they lived 2 houses over and stole your recipe. Back inside, the hearth glows softly, casting orange shadows on the walls. The colors in your home are all warm tones: wood, smoke, fabric browned with time. These are the tones of survival. The colors of we made it through another winter. There's no Instagram filter. Just soot and sun and effort. Now let's peek inside the wealthier homes. You step into a manor house. Maybe you're a servant. Maybe you're just very lost. The air smells of rosemary and roast meat, which is already suspicious. The tapestries on the wall? Deep blues, vibrant reds, even touches of gold thread. These were not dyed by your neighbor's cauldron. These were imported. These cost money. These own you. In the bedroom, you see a canopy bed with drapes dyed in saffron yellow. The lady of the house lies back on a pillow embroidered with stylized falcons. Her gown is soft green, velvet, with scarlet lining. This is the medieval version of a flex. Her maids, in turn, wear subdued tones, blue-gray, dark russet, clearly nice, but not too nice. Because nothing ruins a rich woman's day like a servant looking better than she does. You linger too long and are promptly asked to leave. Back to the village you go, where domestic color is less about luxury and more about mood. Dark reds and browns dominate the taverns. Not by design, but by default. Ale spills, soot stains, and poor lighting turn every shade into something vaguely offensive. The walls might once have been lime-washed white. Now they are the color of damp secrets. In wealthier towns, city homes might feature exterior paints in pastel colors, achieved with crushed chalk and rare dyes. These were usually reserved for merchants or officials who wanted to project authority. Your house is a sturdy beige. Maybe mud-flavored tan, if you're feeling fancy. Color in the domestic sphere reflected your station, your skills, and sometimes your lies. A garment dyed too richly might attract the suspicion of neighbors, or worse, tax collectors. There were even sumptuary laws in some regions forbidding certain classes from wearing specific colors. Imagine being fined for your shirt being too blue. You wander down the road toward the dyer's house. The smell hits you first. Acrid, earthy, a hint of something dead. Because that's what dyeing was. A mix of science, art, and prolonged exposure to things you probably shouldn't inhale. Inside, the dyer stirs a vat. It's thick, bubbling, dark as sin. He's using madder root today, trying to produce a rich red. His hands are permanently stained. His teeth are missing. His cat looks like it's considering other career options. The process is slow. Wool must be mordant first, with alum or urine or both. Then dyed. Then rinsed. Then dried. It's not glamorous. But a well-dyed cloth fetches a good price, and the colors matter. This red? It'll be used for a merchant's wife's overgown. She'll say it's for the holidays. But really, she just wants her sister-in-law to suffer. You step outside, lungs burning slightly from the fumes. The sun is setting. The village turns gold. Everything, your clothes, your home, your neighbors, takes on the same soft tone. And you realize something profound. In a world without synthetic dyes, every color meant something. Every shade had a cost. Every thread was a statement. Color wasn't just decoration. It was biography. And in your case, that biography includes goats, beef porridge, and a deeply unfortunate tunic that smells like cabbage. You wake up to bells. They're not the comforting chimes of a Sunday morning in some twee little English village. No, these bells are sharp, insistent, and thoroughly judgmental. They sound like obligation. Like someone somewhere has decided that you, yes, you in your itchy wool tunic, need to be out of bed and doing something productive. Immediately, you crack one eye open. There's light filtering in through a hole in the roof, highlighting the gentle dust dance of 1,000 dead skin flakes and ash particles. Welcome to morning in a medieval town. Your back hurts. The blanket smells like soup and feet. Possibly your own. Your first thought? I hope I don't run into someone wearing purple today. Because today, you're going into town. And in the medieval world, going into town meant exposure to that treacherous, highly visible ecosystem of social performance, a landscape where color wasn't just clothing. It was rank. It was law. It was an ongoing performance of pretend you're better than the mud you came from. You drag yourself out of bed and dress quickly. Layers. Always layers. Linen shift. Wool tunic. Outer coat. It's cold. You're poor. Your outerwear smells like mildew and damp shame. And off you go. The town is waking up too. Cobblestones are slick with something unspeakable. People shout. Donkeys protest their existence. Somewhere, someone is already yelling about taxes. You're not here for taxes, though. You're here to talk about color. Specifically, color in the public sphere. Because if domestic color was about quiet survival, public color was about screaming status with whatever pigments you could afford or get away with. Let's start with the big one. Purple. If you see someone wearing true purple in a medieval town square, one of two things is happening. You've accidentally wandered into a royal procession. Someone's about to get arrested for sumptuary fraud. Real purple dye, Tyrian purple, was so outrageously expensive that it was basically a flex written in crushed sea snails. Thousands of murex snails had to be boiled and reduced just to make a thimble of the stuff. If you wore purple, it wasn't just a fashion choice. It was a full-on declaration of economic violence. And that's why, in many places, purple was legally restricted to nobility or the clergy. You are neither noble nor particularly holy. So don't even look at it too hard. You don't want the town reef thinking you've gotten ideas. Next up, red. Now, red is tricky. There are levels. Scarlet, for example, meant wealth. Rich, deep reds made with Kermes insects or madder roots were prized and costly. You'd see them on wealthy merchants, bishops, or that one guy in town who sells shoes but also somehow owns 3 properties. Suspicious. On the other hand, dull reds, brick, rust, dried blood, were more accessible. But they carried connotations. Red was the color of temptation, sin, fire, and rage. Wearing too much of it made people wonder if you were trying to seduce someone or murder them. Or both. You pass a woman in a faded cochineal cloak. She nods politely. You wonder who she murdered to afford that. Then there's blue. We've talked about blue before, but let's dig deeper. In medieval Europe, blue had a branding crisis. Early on, it wasn't particularly loved, too hard to make well, too unstable in sunlight. But as the Virgin Mary began getting depicted in blue robes and church art, usually ultramarine, made from Afghan lapis and outrageously expensive, blue slowly rose in status. Woad-dyed blue was cheaper but smelled terrible. Still, it became the color of the working class who aspired to more. It was a humble blue. A blue that said, I'm clean. Mostly. Please consider hiring me. So when you pass a baker in a pale blue apron, know that he's making a subtle statement, I can't afford not brown. I matter. Speaking of brown, yes. The color of peasants, monks, and people who have accepted their fate. Brown was everywhere. Because it was cheap, easy to make, and required almost no effort. Walnut husks, oak bark, and plain neglect all made brown. There were 97 shades of brown, and none of them were trendy. But that didn't mean brown was always boring. A rich, chocolate-toned cloak could still impress, especially when paired with accessories. A belt with brass studs, perhaps. Or a hat with just enough flair to say, I know who I am, but I'm not above pretending. You enter the marketplace. The explosion of color is immediate and a little chaotic. Merchants in burgundy jerkins shout over one another. Their wives in saffron aprons haggle aggressively over root vegetables. A blacksmith's apprentice walks by in a soot-streaked green tunic, probably dyed with nettle and disappointment. And there, at the center of it all, is the town crier. He's dressed in bright yellow. Not the buttery, romantic yellow of Instagram sunsets. No, this is a violent yellow. The kind of yellow that slaps your retinas and says, listen to me now. It's a mixture of weld, stale urine, and powdered brass. He shouts proclamations. Everyone pretends to care. His outfit is ridiculous, but effective. Yellow was another color with a complicated reputation. It could mean wealth, cheerfulness, or festivity. Or it could mean you're being punished. In some towns, Jews were forced to wear yellow badges. Prostitutes might wear yellow veils. It all depended on the century, the region, and who was making up rules that week. But one thing was clear: if you wore yellow, someone had an opinion about it. You duck into a church for relief. Inside, it's quiet, cool. Smells like incense, wet stone, and regret. The priests wear vestments in deep jewel tones: gold, green, red, purple, depending on the season and the feast. Liturgical colors were strictly codified. You couldn't just show up to Easter in Advent purple. That's liturgical whiplash. Here, color meant sanctity, order, ritual. The deep blue of Mary's robe. The blood red of Christ's sacrifice. The gleaming white of purity, which, ironically, was also the color most likely to reveal just how dirty everything actually was. Even your own clothes are now under scrutiny. That drab, beige tunic? It's safe. Bland. You're not making a statement. Which is exactly the statement you want to make in a church where color equals power. Outside again, the sun is higher. The streets are crowded. And now, you get to witness the most colorful people of all: guild members and entertainers. Guild members wore livery, standardized uniforms that declared their trade, loyalty, and general fabulousness. A guild of weavers might wear matching blue and gold tabards. Masons might opt for gray and silver. Bakers wore white because flour was cheap and washing was optional. Color in guild wear was all about branding. A guild with no color was a guild without customers. You had to stand out, without upstaging the nobility, of course, or you'd find yourself in a muddy ditch accidentally trampled by a baron's horse. Then there were jesters, minstrels, and performers. Their clothing? Chaos incarnate. Striped leggings. Polka dots. Mismatched sleeves. Colors that should never be seen together, like lime green and blood orange. But that was the point. Their outfits were armor. Color made them visible. Laughter made them safe. Until it didn't. Because wearing too many bright colors outside your station was dangerous. It meant you were drawing attention. In a society obsessed with order, that was as good as declaring war. You pass a young boy selling dyed ribbons. The reds are too red. The greens are sickly. The purples are clearly lying. But people buy them. Because color is aspiration. And even if your tunic is gray and your shoes are falling apart, a little splash of ribbon tells the world, I tried. As the sun begins to lower, you make your way to the town gate. The guards are in standard livery, dull blue and brown. Not because it's stylish, but because it's affordable, hard-wearing, and easy to recognize from a distance. One of them looks at your shoes and laughs. You choose not to respond. It's not the worst insult you've endured today. The gate opens. You walk back toward your village. Tired. Hungry. Covered in the invisible dust of social hierarchy. And as you walk, you realize something. In the medieval public sphere, color wasn't just a matter of fashion. It was law. It was language. It was judgment, punishment, pride, and performance, all stitched into your sleeves and soaked into your hemline. You were your color, and your color was you. So the next time you put on a t-shirt that cost $8 and didn't involve fermented snail juice, say a little thank you to the dyers who came before. They suffered. They boiled things that should not be boiled. They stank. Also, you could wear blue jeans and pretend your choices were neutral. You wake up. Again. Not in a cozy cottage this time, but on a pallet in the corner of a medieval dye workshop. Congratulations. You've officially hit rock bottom on the 14th century Airbnb scale. Your mattress is a wooden plank softened only by a generous layer of textile dust, and your pillow is actually a bundle of rags tied together with string. It smells faintly of onion soup and broken dreams. You sit up, slowly. Everything creaks, your knees, the bed, the structure itself. The morning light seeps in through the warped wooden shutters, revealing the cloudy outlines of barrels, buckets, and vats. Welcome to the inner sanctum of medieval color production, the dyer's workshop. The air is thick, a heady perfume of fermented urine, moldy wool, wet ashes, and despair. You are, quite literally, surrounded by the smells of fashion. This is not a glamorous chapter. This is a chapter about the making of color. The process. The long, gross, chemically questionable journey that turned a piece of linen from sad oatmeal beige to stunning royal blue, or whatever passed for stunning after you've been smelling boiling cow dung all day. And it all starts, as most good medieval miseries do, with pee. Yes, urine. Specifically, stale urine. Collected in buckets, pots, and public receptacles. Left to ferment until it became a potent source of ammonia. Dyers used this charming liquid as a fixative, a mordant, to help dyes bond to cloth. If you're wondering whether the clothes still smelled like pee afterward, yes. Of course they did. Everything did. You did. The world did. So before we go deeper, this is your gentle reminder. Go ahead and like the video if you're still with me through this fragrant tale of suffering and snails. And hit that subscribe button if you enjoy learning obscure facts while imagining the slow decay of your senses. Also, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. I love seeing how far across time zones and sleep schedules this weird little journey takes us. Now, let's talk about blue again. Not the symbolism this time, the process. You see, in most of Europe, blue came from woad. A plant. A weed, really. Woad was chopped, soaked, fermented, and then slapped into massive vats where it was joined by, you guessed it, human urine. The ammonia helped break down the plant matter and allowed the pigment to oxidize. The result? A stinking, frothy, yellow-green soup that, when the fabric was dipped and later exposed to air, turned blue. That transformation, yellowish goop to blue cloth, felt magical. To us, a neat chemical reaction. To them, witchcraft-adjacent miracle. You'd see the fabric lifted from the vat looking disappointing, almost jaundiced, and then, like a color-changing chameleon of destiny, it would begin to bloom into blue as the oxygen hit it. This was exciting. As exciting as things got in a world without YouTube. But the smell? That stayed with you. 4 days. Weeks. If you worked in a dye shop, you didn't make friends easily. Even your dog hesitated when you came home. Now, let's get grosser. Enter red. Real, luxurious red came from crush bugs. Specifically, the Kermes insect, a tiny parasite that lived on certain types of oak in the Mediterranean. To make the dye, you had to collect thousands of the little guys, dry them, crush them into powder, and then stew the powder with alum and other mordants. The result was a rich crimson dye, expensive, vibrant, and heavily associated with wealth, sin, and extremely aggressive monks. Later, in the post-medieval world, cochineal from the Americas would blow European minds. But in this period, it was all about the bugs you could find, kill, and mash locally. And don't forget madder root, another red dye, this time vegetable-based. Less fancy, more earthy, often used by folks who didn't have access to bug money. Now, yellow. This one is deceptively cheerful. It came from weld, a tall, spindly plant with little yellow flowers. Not too stinky, not too deadly, fairly accessible. In fact, weld was one of the few dye plants that didn't want to murder you slowly through skin contact or toxic fumes. But then there's orpiment, a yellow pigment made from arsenic sulfide. Yes, arsenic. You know, the poison. Medieval dyers used it for bright yellow shades when weld wasn't cutting it. Handling it too much could cause skin lesions, nerve damage, or slow death. But hey, fashion hurts. Or at least, it used to actively kill. This brings us to green, a deeply problematic color for medieval dyers. You'd think, what with the whole plants are green thing, it'd be easy. But no. Green was notoriously difficult to dye into cloth in a stable, lasting way. It faded. It changed. It turned brown. It betrayed you. Like a bad relationship, only with more fungus. So dyers often had to layer colors, first dyeing a fabric yellow, then over-dyeing it with blue to make green. Sounds clever, right? Until you realize how much this depended on perfectly balanced vats of pea-fermented mush and insect powder. If your measurements were off, you ended up with swamp sludge or something that looked like spoiled cheese. Then, of course, you had black. You might think black would be easy. Just soak it in soot? Rub it in dirt? Nope. Real, deep, lasting black was hard. You needed iron salts, tannin-rich materials like gallnuts, and patience. Gallnuts, by the way, are weird little growths that form on oak trees when certain insects lay their eggs in them. The result? A very high concentration of tannin. Perfect for dyeing. Also great for ink. Also, yes, once again, extremely gross. Black dyers often had the worst jobs of all. The combination of iron, tannin, and other additives created heavy, caustic dye baths that could eat through skin and fabric alike. But people loved black. It was chic. It was serious. It was dramatic. It said, I mourn stylishly. Of course, most people didn't wear deep black. They wore patchy dark browns and grayish near blacks and told themselves it was basically the same. Spoiler, it wasn't. Now let's take a moment to consider the tools of the trade. You've got your vats, massive wooden barrels, some big enough to fall into. Not a theoretical concern, by the way. People did fall in. They did drown. In dye. Possibly the worst obituary imaginable. You've got your tongs, paddles, and rods, all used to stir the fabric through the soup of doom. Many of them were stained from years of use, and they smelled worse than the armpit of a sheep during a drought. You had to control the temperature, too. No fancy thermometers. Just guesswork and pain. Stick your hand in and see if it hurts. If yes, it's probably working. Now imagine doing all of this while wearing wool. In summer. In a shed with no ventilation. And that's your life as a dyer. You work with chemicals you don't understand, colors you can barely trust, and a smell that haunts your every social interaction. But there's pride, too. Because when the cloth comes out right, when it shimmers just so, when it holds its color through washing and sun, you've made something close to magic. People would pay for your work. Nobles would wear it. Clergy would pray in it. Soldiers would march into battle in it. Lovers would meet in it. Children would be christened in it. All because you stewed in a puddle of fermented plant urine for 8 hours a day. Let's talk social standing for a moment. Being a dyer was complicated. You weren't noble. You weren't even that respected. But you weren't at the bottom either. Dyers could belong to guilds, form networks, regulate quality, and build businesses. Some even became wealthy. Most didn't. But hey, that's true of every profession in history. Including, funnily enough, YouTubers. Also, dye secrets were guarded ferociously. Recipes were family heirlooms, passed down through generations like sacred knowledge. If you stole another dyer's method, you weren't just committing industrial espionage. You were committing a kind of spiritual theft. You didn't mess with another person's black formula. Not unless you wanted your well poisoned. Which brings us, finally, to accidents. Dyeing accidents were spectacular. Fabric coming out the wrong color. Mild fabric catching fire because someone spilled spirits near the cauldron. Less mild. Apprentice falling into the indigo vat and turning blue for a week. Happens more often than you'd think. Color was chemistry. And in a time before safety goggles or gloves or basic literacy, chemistry was dangerous. But oh, the results. When it worked, it was alchemy. A drab piece of rough spun wool turned into a luminous robe. A splotchy linen rag became a priestole. Color changed everything. It made you visible. It made you powerful. Or at least, slightly less invisible. So you rinse your hands. They're stained. Your fingernails are blue. Your tunic is blotched with spots of red and green. You stink of effort, of human enterprise, of botanical violence. And you go home, proud. Because in a world without mass production, without synthetic dyes, without fast fashion, your hands made meaning visible. Next time someone says fashion is superficial, you'll know better. It's sweat. It's science. It's snails and arsenic and lies. You wake up. Again. This time to the muffled thud of a sheep sneezing outside your door. You're no longer in the dye workshop. Congratulations. You've been promoted, or possibly demoted, to the rural fringes of a medieval estate. Specifically, you're in a modest weaver's cottage, somewhere damp, mossy, and persistently gray. It's 5 a.m., the chickens are already judgmental, and your bladder is deeply offended by the bucket situation. But you don't have time for reflection. You have a full day of weaving ahead. Or more accurately, tangling, combing, cursing, spinning, knotting, re-knotting, forgetting to eat, and staring deeply into the abyss of warp and weft. Yes, welcome to the next stage of medieval color, textile life after dye. Because as much as medieval fashion obsessed over color, the real artistry didn't stop when the dye dried. It had to be woven, worn, re-dyed, rewoven, patched, inherited, and eventually buried in the ground with its owner. Color was just the beginning. Now we get to talk about the fabric of society. Literally. And don't worry, we're still comfortably nestled in the warm embrace of historical discomfort, strange smells, and bodily discomfort. This is still medieval Europe, after all. First, let's talk about cloth production. Because this is where color came to life and where it had to prove itself. It's one thing for a bolt of wool to look pretty hanging on a peg. It's another thing for it to survive the medieval equivalent of a TikTok dance, kneeling in church for 6 hours, being rained on in a field, and walking 40 miles with a cartload of turnips. The most common materials? Wool and linen. Wool was king. It was versatile, forgiving, warm even when wet, and it came in natural shades before any dye even touched it. Cream, brown, black, gray. These were the colors of the everyday peasant. If you were lucky, your tunic might be made from wool that had been overdyed, a cheap second dip into the leftover dye bath from the noble's tunic. Congratulations! You're now wearing what can only be described as noble runoff. Linen, on the other hand, was cooler, crisper, harder to dye, and almost always used for undergarments. Think of it like the medieval version of a Hanes undershirt, essential, overlooked, and slightly scratchy. If you were very fancy, or possibly in possession of a death wish for vanity, you might work with silk. But we'll get to that shiny death trap later. Let's talk about the actual weaving. You've got your loom. It's not modern, sleek, or ergonomic. It's a vertical warp-weighted beast made out of wood that creaks like it's haunted. Which, let's face it, it probably is. Everything was. The idea is simple. Threads stretched vertically, warp, and threads passed through them horizontally, weft, to create fabric. Easy, right? Wrong. Threading the loom takes days, weeks, even if your fingers are cold or you made the mistake of blinking too hard and losing your place. And don't even think about making a mistake. If you miscount your heddles, you could end up with a diagonal tunic and a local scandal. Once you're finally weaving, it's rhythmic, repetitive, vaguely hypnotic. You pass the shuttle back and forth. Beat the thread. Pass. Beat. Pass. Beat. This goes on for hours. You forget what food tastes like. You forget the name of your youngest child. You forget your own name. You become the loom. But hey, your cloth is growing. And into this humble cloth, dyed or undyed, people wove meaning. Sometimes literally. Certain patterns indicated family status, marital availability, religious affiliation, or regional identity. A striped cloak might mean you're from Brittany. A check one? Scotland. A very plain one? Probably someone who doesn't have time for your fashion games because they're too busy digging up potatoes with their bare hands. But don't be fooled. Color was still in the picture. You see, it wasn't just what you dyed, but how much of it. A tunic that was fully dyed in a rich color screamed wealth. That meant it had been dyed as a whole cloth and re-dyed after construction, to even out any fading or stitching marks. This was expensive, time-consuming, and completely impractical for anyone who had to work for a living. Most people, their clothes were piece-dyed, individual segments of cloth dunked separately, sometimes using cheaper dyes, and then sewn together. The result? A patchwork of slightly mismatched tones. Clothes enough from a distance. Sort of. In the dark. If you squint. Now here's where it gets truly delicious, sumptuary laws. You knew it was coming. Because nothing screams medieval overreach like the government telling you what colors you're allowed to wear. These laws varied across time and region, but they all had the same basic flavor. If you're a peasant, stop trying to look fabulous. Seriously. Cut it out. In England, for example, a series of laws during the 14th century forbade commoners from wearing certain fabrics or colors that were reserved for the nobility. Want to wear scarlet? Sorry, serf. That's for the countess and her 47 cats. Feel like trying purple? That's treason adjacent. Even the type of trim mattered. For from certain animals? Illegal for non-nobles. Gold thread? Not unless you own land, pay taxes, and regularly dine with someone named Eustace. The stated reason for all of this was, of course, moral panic. The fear that the lower classes might start pretending to be higher up the food chain. What's next? A blacksmith marrying a merchant's daughter? The horror. The actual reason? Economic control. The ruling classes needed to make sure their social dominance was visible, enforceable, and die fast. And color, bright, rare, expensive color, was the perfect tool. But humans being humans, people found loopholes. Some peasants wore noble colors on undergarments, where they wouldn't be seen. Some tailors got creative with lining and inside seams. There are even records of cloth being dyed in multiple layers to create iridescence, so it looked like one thing in sunlight and another in shadow. A medieval color change dress. Eat your heart out. Instagram filters. Speaking of cleverness, let's talk about the recycling economy. Because no one threw clothes away. Ever. Medieval garments were patched, repatched, taken apart, resewn, handed down, turned into pillowcases, and eventually used to mop up goat vomit. There were entire industries built around re-dyeing faded fabrics. A dull brown cloak could be boiled with woad to bring it back to a respectable gray blue. A yellow-stained shift could be overdyed green. If you had access to cochineal later on, you might even revive a faded tunic into something vaguely reddish and therefore vaguely powerful. Clothes were assets. They were willed to relatives, pawned for money, inventoried in estates, sometimes listed before the children. And even after they died, people wanted to be buried in color. There are church records noting specific requests: bury me in my blue cloak, my green Sunday gown, that one tunic with the good buttons and not the weird mold smell. Why? Because color meant something, even in death. And then we get to the clergy. The clergy. They had their own rules, of course. Monks were meant to wear simple, undyed wool, brown, gray, or black. Humble, earthy, mortifying the flesh, etc. But higher-ranking clergy? Oh, they had color. Rich purples, reds, and golds. The Pope, in particular, was basically the walking Pantone swatch book of divine privilege. And then there's the court. Court fashion was like the Met Gala, but every day. Colors weren't just worn, they were weaponized. A noblewoman might arrive in a gown so vivid it made other people's eyes water. A courtier might match his tunic to the livery of a visiting ambassador just to show political alignment. Bright colors, rare dyes, luxurious fabrics, these were status signals so blinding they practically screamed in Gregorian chant. Which brings us to one final, beautifully absurd anecdote. In 1399, Richard II of England, before being deposed, humiliated, and probably quietly murdered, had his entire court wearing white and green as a symbol of royal unity. It was a fashion campaign, a brand rollout. Everyone had to comply. It was a vibe. And then, a few months later, he was overthrown by someone wearing red. So yes, color mattered. And it betrayed you. But not you, dear weaver. You're still at your loom. Your fingers are bleeding slightly. Your back aches. Your stomach is quietly mutinous from 2 meals of barley stew and exactly 1 leak. But your cloth? It's coming together. The colors may not be noble, but they are yours. You wake up. Again. Because of course you do. This time, you're in a palace. Sort of. You're in a drafty stone chamber that's technically part of a castle, but feels suspiciously like a barn with ambition. There's a tapestry hanging crookedly on the wall, which helps block the breeze from the arrow slit someone keeps calling a window. The fire is out. The candles are melted into mournful wax pancakes. And your nose is doing that medieval thing where it both runs and crusts at the same time. Charming. Your outfit is made of wool, yes, but it's dyed, tailored, and suspiciously clean. Why? Because you're no longer a peasant. You've been transported, gently and sarcastically, into the glittering, lethal world of high medieval fashion. Court life. Status games. Fancy fabrics and fatal color choices. You've made it to the top of the fabric food chain. Congratulations. There's absolutely nothing here for you but judgment. Welcome to the world of silk. Let's start with the obvious. You're not supposed to be here. Silk was not for the likes of you. Or me. Or anyone who couldn't pay a tax collector to stop making eye contact. Silk in medieval Europe was the holy grail of fabric. Imported, hoarded, revered, and occasionally stolen with dramatic flair. It came from the East, originally from China, and later through Byzantium, Islamic Spain, and the Italian states. To own it was a miracle. To wear it? Political power on legs. You want soft? Silk is soft. Like angel breath woven into thread. You want color? Silk holds dye like it was born for it. Vivid crimsons, deep purples, electric blues, radiant golds. And oh, it shimmers. Silk practically performs. When you walk, it flows like water. When you turn, it catches the light like scandal. And it was wildly, offensively expensive. Why? Because silk production is a nightmare ballet of worms, trees, and very tired women. Let's go on a quick field trip, shall we? Imagine you're in China, around the 6th century BCE. You're standing in a quiet grove of mulberry trees, being aggressively stared at by silkworms, technically moth caterpillars that eat, spin, and dye for fashion. Each little worm spins a cocoon of silk filament up to 1,000 meters long, which is adorable, until you realize it takes about 2,500 silkworms to make a single tunic. And to harvest the silk, you boil them. Alive. Yes. That's the bit they don't put on the label. Handmade with 100% luxury. Also, mild worm homicide. Eventually, the Byzantine Empire stole the secret, smuggled silkworm eggs and bamboo canes, if you believe the tales. And Europe was hooked. Italy, in particular, became a major producer, with cities like Lucca and Venice churning out brocades, damasks, and velvets that made everyone else look like they were wearing burlap dipped in sadness. So before you get too cozy in your fancy silk robe, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you're actually enjoying this historical fever dream I'm narrating. And tell me where you're tuning in from and what ungodly hour it is. I love imagining someone in Idaho trying to fall asleep to the soothing sounds of worm death and medieval class warfare. Now, back to the fabric. Silk wasn't just about comfort. In fact, it was rarely comfortable. Unlined, it could be slippery, itchy, or strangely clingy. And it didn't breathe well, so you'd sweat like a roast pig at a feast. But no one cared. Because silk was social currency. Political theater. A walking resume. Which brings us to embroidery, the glittering cherry on the medieval cake of self-importance. Embroidery was not just decorative. It was a statement. A weapon. A deeply personal and highly visible flex. Threads of silk, gold, and silver were stitched into every available surface. Hems, cuffs, cloaks, tunics, underthings if you were feeling spicy. The richest embroideries were opus anglicanum, English work, renowned across Europe for their finesse. What did they embroider? Everything. Birds, saints, lions, biblical trauma, heraldic animals stabbing each other politely, scenes from the life of Christ, ideally bleeding in tasteful gold. It was part art, part propaganda, part divine cosplay. But you didn't stitch it yourself. Oh no. Unless you were a nun. Or very poor. Or both. Royal embroidery was done by professional guild members, men, mostly. Their workshops produced pieces that could take years. Cloaks that weighed more than small horses. Capes that required squires just to hold them. It was the medieval version of buying a limited edition sports car, impractical, powerful, and deeply unnecessary. Let's pause for a sensory moment. Your robe rustles like whispers. The embroidery on your sleeves itches faintly against your forearms. You smell of rosemary water and ambition. You walk slowly, because your shoes were not made for walking. They're made for being admired. Behind you, your servant carries your outer cloak, because it's too heavy for your puny courtly arms. You smile, but only slightly. Wrinkles are for peasants. This is the peak of medieval color, and it is exhausting. Now, let's take a slight detour to the deadly side of dye. You didn't think we'd get through this without some mild toxicity, did you? Because if there's one thing medieval people loved more than putting birds in pies, it was using poisonous ingredients in their dyes. Let's start with green. Green was a hard color to get right. Nature is full of green, but those greens don't like to stay on cloth. So dyers got creative. And by creative, I mean murderous. Verdigris, a bright, vibrant green, was made by soaking copper plates in vinegar until they corroded. This powder was then added to dye. Beautiful, yes. Also acidic enough to eat holes in fabric and skin. Then there was arsenic green. Technically later, in the 18th and 19th centuries, but its medieval cousin wasn't far behind in terms of horrible idea, beautiful result. The brighter the green, the closer you were to death by slough, stylish poisoning. And then there's red. Cinnabar, mercury sulfide, was used in pigment and sometimes in dyes. It gave a deep, almost supernatural red. Also gave you neurological damage, possibly hallucinations, and maybe death. You know, casual consequences. Even the mordants used to fix dyes, alum, lye, iron salts, could ruin skin, irritate lungs, and turn your hands into cracked horror shows of medieval labor. If you were a dyer, you smelled awful, looked worse, and probably had a shortened life expectancy. But hey, at least the cloth looked fabulous. And don't even get me started on the fumes. Imagine standing in a small stone room, over a cauldron, full of boiling urine, vinegar, and sheep-based chemicals, for hours. It's like spa day, but the spa is cursed and everyone dies. Meanwhile, nobles complained that their robes were slightly too stiff. Perspective. Now, to our favorite, purple. We touched on this earlier. Let's go deeper. True purple, the imperial kind, came from sea snails. Specifically, murex snails, harvested by the thousands and crushed for their glandular fluid. Sounds gross? It is. It also smells like decomposing regret. The scent was so strong that dyers were often forced to work outside the city walls. They were basically fashion's untouchables. And yet, purple was sacred. Roman emperors wore it. Bishops wore it. Charlemagne bathed in it metaphorically, and maybe literally. I wouldn't put it past him. To own a purple cloak was to say, I am better than you, and I have the dead snails to prove it. But it gets worse. By the time of the medieval church, purple had become symbolic of suffering, penitence, and divine authority. So naturally, monks wore brown. But bishops? Purple. So did royalty. So did people who wanted to make absolutely sure you knew they were better than you. It's the color of power, grief, violence, sacrifice, and snobbery. Perfect. And then, there were fashion disasters. You didn't think they were immune, did you? Medieval nobles might be rich, but they were still human. That means bad taste, overconfidence, and the occasional truly regrettable outfit. You'd see sleeves so long they dragged on the floor and had to be tied up with ribbons. Hats so high they had to be reinforced with wire. Cloaks so wide they knocked things off tables. There were fashion battles over how pointed your shoes could be. Long toes equals high status, obviously. Functionality? Unimportant. At one point, doublets were so tight they had to be sewn shut on the body. If you needed the bathroom, you were out of luck. But hey, you look sharp for those 5 hours of wine, lute music, and quiet dysentery. Color amplified all of this. Too much gold? You looked like a bejeweled turnip. Too much black? People assumed you were in mourning or trying to look mysterious. Color had to be just right. Too rich, and it was offensive. Too dull, and it was sad. Fashion was a battlefield, and the rules changed with every king, bishop, or fussy queen. And if you got it wrong, you were mocked. Or worse, ignored. Because in medieval society, silence was social death. Color kept you visible. Now, let's end this chapter where all color goes eventually. The grave. Yes, you'll die. It's medieval Europe. Everyone does. But you might be buried in your best clothes. Maybe that robe with the green trim. Or the red tunic with the stain from that unfortunate goose incident. Sometimes, garments were cut to shroud the body. Sometimes they were laid over the corpse, whole and uncut, like a final offering. And centuries later, archaeologists would find them, faded, twisted, disintegrating, and marvel at what was once vivid. Color doesn't last, but meaning lingers.